Happy Easter 10:30. How we doing, guys? How we doing? As John mentioned, my name's Bryan, and I am one of the pastors here on staff. It's so good to be with you this Easter. Quick couple introductions. One, I've mentioned my name. If I haven't met you, I would love to meet you. I'm going to be in the lobby right afterwards. Just come, say hi, please. And then an introduction to Anchor. John already mentioned some things, but Anchor is the result of my family and some friends moving here around 5 years ago to plant a church with a dream that we had about what God might be doing, and it's cool to see you in the middle of what God has done. Isn't that cool? Isn't that cool? So at Anchor, we are a community of imperfect Jesus followers living for the good of Tacoma and the greater South Sound. I want to break that down really quickly because it's important that we have that in our memory. We are a community of imperfect Jesus followers. Look around you, you're going to see somebody that's imperfect. I remember a couple weeks ago, they came maybe for Anchor for the first time, and they're like, "We love Anchor." And my response was like, "That's so cool. In 2 weeks, we're going to let you down because we're imperfect. We're imperfect." But we're in perfect community, right? So that means that in this space, there's different parts of town, there's different socioeconomic statuses, there's different ethnicities, but we make up one community of imperfect Jesus followers. Yeah. And we are living for the good of Tacoma and the greater South Sound. That's it. Community of imperfect Jesus followers living for the good of Tacoma and the greater South Sound. Well, one thing stretching back all the way to the very first Easter that Jesus followers have done is this call and response thing where the initial people to see the resurrection came back and told the rest of the disciples, they said, "He is risen." And we've had this call and response that we've done since that point in church settings on Easter. And I'm going to invite you into doing it. So if you're not been around church for a while, I understand. If you're unfamiliar with Christianity or haven't done this, I just want to prime the pump and set you up right. So, okay, I'm not going to ask you to respond now, but I'm telling you what to say when I ask you to say it, okay? So I'm going to say, "He is risen," and you're going to respond with, "He is risen indeed," okay? You ready for this? Raise your hand if you're ready. All right, we see some people that are ready, and some people maybe we're still sleeping. That's fine. Okay, so on the count of three, 1, 2, 3, He is risen. He is risen. You guys are professionals. You guys are pros. Hey, one thing I've been thinking about recently is my freshman year in college. You see, one thing I was fixated, I was just so focused on that freshman year of college was joining the collegiate cross country and track team of the team or the school that I went to. In fact, that's the only reason that I applied to the school, because I thought there might be a slim chance that I actually make it onto the cross country and track team. The whole summer before, I spent training and pouring on the miles like I had never done before. You see, in high school, I was good enough to make varsity the last 2 years of my high school experience. Junior year, senior year. For those of us forgot, those are the years, some of the years in high school. Remember those? The first couple years, freshman and sophomore, I was nowhere near good enough. So I was one of those guys, if you're familiar with high school sports, I'm like good-ish, but not great, right? I was not getting any letters from any university saying, "Please, please, please, would you come to our school and run for us?" But I wanted to. I'm one of those weird people that enjoys running, I know. So all through that summer, I just would train all the time. In fact, sometimes go for 13, 15-mile runs, and people would drive by me 3 times in the middle of my run. They'd come back later in the day and say, "Bryan, was that you all 3 of those times?" And I would say, "Yeah, guilty." And they're like, "The 3rd time, it looked like you were going to die. Are you okay? In the head, but also physically?" And I'm unsure about both, but we're going to keep going forward. Well, we got to the day where we had the time trial to see who made the team and to see who got sent back to their home and welcomed back when college started. I towed the line. I remember looking to the left and to the right. To the left, I saw someone who seemed clearly better than me. To the right, I saw someone who looked definitely better than me. So I was a little nervous about what this time trial was going to yield for me. But I knew that I had one secret that they probably didn't. I trained way harder than I'm sure any of these other people because I knew there was no way I was going to make it unless I trained that hard. Well, I got good news for you guys. I got third place at that time trial. And you know what? I'm still pretty proud of that. The bummer is, 3 weeks later, I was so burnt and toasted from all the training I did throughout the summer, my legs gave out, and I ended up being close to the end of every race for the rest of the season. I still made the team, though. They couldn't go back on that one. But all through the summer, up to that very first day where I had that time trial, I was asking a question underneath my words, underneath my thoughts, that very much I think everyone can relate to. It goes like this: am I good enough? Raise your hand if you've ever asked that question. Am I good enough? We have some honest people in the house today. Am I good enough? It's a question we ask in job interviews. When people are asking us questions, we're asking the question, am I good enough? In fact, I think there's two types of people that don't ask that question in a job interview setting. It's either sociopaths or people that have gone through lots of counseling. So it's either incredibly unhealthy people or incredibly healthy people. Most of us just ask the question, I don't know if I'm good enough. We ask that question when we stutter and stammer out the words, would you go on a date with me, to that crush that one time you remember. Underneath those words, we're asking the question, I wonder if I'm good enough. We ask that question when we're waiting to hear back from our mortgage broker. Is my credit score good enough? Is my debt to income ratio good enough? Am I good enough? We ask that question when we're trying out on a team. It's a question that lingers and haunts through every transitional phase of our life. But here's the tragedy. Too often, some of us in this room and not in this room ask that question with regard to church. Am I good enough? I know this firsthand because I'm a church planner. And here's one thing you need to know about church planners. We are less inclined to hang out with church folk than hang out with people that aren't church folk. I still have this basic inclination. A lot of my best friends are people that don't go to church or aren't Jesus followers. And especially in the first few years, I found myself hanging out with people that didn't want to hang out with church people. And so sometimes it was awkward when they would ask the question, so what do you do again? And I would say I'm a church planner. And they would be like, wait, what even is that? And so I would use the more popular term, I'm a pastor, and then they would get really silent, and I would just enjoy that silence. Just see, hey, I wonder what's going to happen next. Eat my proverbial popcorn. But if the conversation kept going, and oftentimes it did, I would get startled by some of the responses. You see, most people didn't have an intellectual obstacle to the belief in God. It wasn't like they were saying, well, I just can't feel them belief. I can't understand why I would. That's not what they were thinking. The reason many people were kept from coming into church was that same question that I already mentioned. I don't know if I'm good enough. And that broke my heart. It still breaks my heart. It breaks my heart for a couple reasons. One is summed up by the line from Chance the Rapper's recent song, Child of God, which is one of my favorite songs right now. He says in that song, I'm following Jesus with wet feet, which if you don't get that intuitively, he's referencing Peter as he steps out towards Jesus, wanting to walk on water as Jesus is walking on water, but Peter starts to sink a little bit. His feet get wet. And so Chance is saying, I'm like Peter. I'm kind of stepping out, trying, but I'm doing it imperfectly. And I love that because it articulates the reality that actually none of us are good enough. If we're to play that line with regard to church, we are all imperfect, as the sign on the wall says. Which means that in Anchor, we have no space for that kind of snooty, holier than thou religiosity, lifting up the nose, There's no space for that in this place. I mean, we're trying to make sure that's very clear by having a sleeve of tattoos, Trying to make sure that's very clear. It's on my sleeve, as they say. I don't think Jesus had much space for that kind of religiosity either. That's why he zeroed in on some of the religious establishment more often than anything else. But second, the reason why The idea of I'm not good enough was tragic in my ears from friends that I had, was because, in fact, the prerequisite for being in a relationship with God is admitting that we're imperfect. And the only thing that disqualifies us for being in a relationship with God is thinking that we are good enough. This is nowhere more clear in Scripture than in the resurrection accounts that we're going to look at today. You see, Jesus could have come back in his resurrected state and gone to his disciples with a billy club and say, "You idiots, didn't you see all the great things I did? I rose Lazarus from the dead. He came out and that was me that did it. So why wouldn't you think that I can do it now, you dummies?" Instead, you're distancing yourself from me. You're denying me. You're betraying me, but you're not believing in me, you idiots. But he doesn't do that. In fact, so far from that. He meets the disciples in their sorrow. He meets the disciples in their fear. He meets the disciples in their doubt. He meets the disciples in the middle of their I'm not good enough. And let me tell you a secret. He is still meeting modern day disciples in those very places. That is good news for all of us. First point I want to look at is just very simple. It's Jesus meets us in our sorrow. Jesus meets us in our sorrow. You see, one of Jesus' closest disciples was actually a woman. She's not cast as one of the 12 from memory and study, but she was very much a disciple, Mary Magdalene. In Luke, which is a gospel, and if you're unfamiliar with the idea of the gospels, they are the accounts, the biographies, if you will, of Jesus' birth, life, ministry, death, and resurrection. Luke is one of these gospels. Eyewitness accounts of the very things that Jesus did. So in Luke chapter 8, we find out about these women that are following Jesus just like the 12 disciples did. They are equal disciples following and learning from his teachings and his way. And it talks about Mary Magdalene being someone that had 7 demons exorcised from her. I don't know what that feels like, but it must have been pretty powerful. And so she was so touched and healed by what Jesus did in her life that she actually took from her financial resources and gave them to Jesus' ministry so that more people would experience what she experienced. She wanted what she experienced to keep going farther to more people. So she was this eyewitness account of Jesus' work, his ministry. She saw the multiplication of loaves. She saw when the lepers were healed. She heard the teachings from Jesus firsthand. And then she saw him die. And she was crushed. So in John chapter 20, verse 11, we read, "Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying, and she wept, or as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb." She's looking in. And she saw 2 angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. And they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she didn't realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." I love this just intro into Mary's experience because she is feeling her feelings, right? She is not hiding what she is experiencing. And so when the angels, and it's important to note that she probably understood that they were angels. There's nothing keeping her. It says she didn't understand that it was Jesus, but there's nothing keeping her from seeing that these are angels. When the angels say, "Hey, what's the deal? Why are you crying?" she comes back with this, "What do you mean, what's the deal? You guys are angels. Come on, what's going on? Jesus died. That's why I'm crying. Duh." She is frustrated, she's angry, and she's sorrowful. And she doesn't care if it's angels asking her or someone else, but she's going to let them know. And then she hears it from another guy, and it happens to be Jesus, but she doesn't know it's Jesus. And it's interesting because it says she turned towards Jesus, but then a couple of verses later, it says that, or a couple lines later, it says that she turned back towards Jesus. So it's like she's turning and she's looking away. She's unclear. Maybe she doesn't have a good glimpse, and she's like, hey, you know what? If you've taken the body away, could I just tell me where it is, because I want to honor him. He transformed my life. The best I could do would be to honor him. And then something happens. Right in the middle of her anger, sorrow, and grief, she hears her name. Verse 16 says, Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned toward him and cried out in her mother tongue, Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. There's something about hearing your name, isn't there? Hearing somebody speak your name. Something about when somebody remembers your name. Means that they've paid attention to you. Or when you hear somebody that you know well say your name, there's something about that. I imagine that Jesus had spoken Mary's name many places. Maybe the first time was when she was healed, delivered from the demonic oppression, and she heard her name with sanity and serenity for the first time. Mary, are you there? Are you there, Mary? From Jesus, as he looked at her, freshly healed and delivered. Mary. I imagine there's other times, because she just kept following Jesus. So there's plenty of other times. I imagine maybe one time Jesus looked towards her at the table as the disciples were disputing about some theological matter, and he just said, hey, Mary. And she heard her name from his lips again. Maybe, I think it's fair to imagine, there was another time where Jesus had to get stern with her and say, now, Mary. And so here we see that Mary hears her name from his lips, and it's that brings her to the awareness that this is not the gardener, but that this is in fact Jesus. And everything shifts. It's important that John records it's in the Aramaic, in her mother tongue, in her first language, that she cries out, teacher, Rabboni, her heart language. There's a shift from sorrow to something else. Let me just tell you, that Jesus wants to meet you right in the middle of your sorrow. Some of us, we're really good at playing that game, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. Anybody ever play that game? Some of you know that dog with the fire in the cartoon with the dog and the fire in the background. He's saying, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. Our worship pastor actually has a little sculpture of it right there on his desk. I don't know if that says anything about our work culture at all. Hey, Pete. But you know that I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine game? Where we're pretending that we're fine and we're trying to convince everybody that we're fine, and we're not convincing anybody, lest ourselves, that we're actually fine. Here's the thing. The more we play the I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine game, the more we run away from the place where God wants to meet us. God wants to meet us not in the presentation of us being okay, but in the reality of our heart and what's going on in our head. He wants to meet us in that place. I can't think of a better contemporary example of Mary than a woman named Anne Lamott, who in her book Traveling Mercies describes her spiritual journey towards becoming a follower of Jesus. Now, if you have your phone out and you're already Googling Traveling Mercies, one, props, that's quick fingers. And second, beware that this is not just kind of any churchy story. She has a background that is real and raw. In fact, right before the quote that I am going to read right now, she's just had an abortion and she's on and off pills and on and off the bottle, and then somehow stumbles into a church once and then twice, and here, pick up the quote. And 1 week later, when I went back to church, I was so hungover that I couldn't stand up for the songs. And this time, I stayed for the sermon, which I just thought was so ridiculous. Anybody out there? Like someone trying to convince me of the existence of extraterrestrials. But the last song was so deep and raw and pure that I could not escape. It was as if the people were singing in between the notes, weeping and joyful at the same time. And I felt like their voices or something was rocking me in its bosom, holding me like a scared kid. And I opened up to that feeling, and it washed over me. I began to cry and left before the benediction. And I raced home and felt, and here she describes earlier in the book that Jesus was chasing her like a little cat, and felt the little cat running along at my heels, and walked down the dock past dozens of potted flowers under a sky as blue as one of God's own dreams. And I opened the door to my houseboat, and I stood there a minute, and I hung my head and said, I quit. I took a long, deep breath and said out loud, all right, you can come in. So this was my beautiful moment of conversion. Anne and Mary share a similar story of meeting Jesus in the midst of unimaginable sorrow and experiencing unimaginable healing. The thing that is to note is that Jesus doesn't wait for us to be good enough. He shows up right in the middle of the sorrow, right in the middle of the pain. He doesn't wait for us to clean ourselves up. In fact, he says, if you try to clean yourself up, you actually can't be in a relationship with me. You have to be real and raw. You have to know that you're not good enough. Jesus meets us not only in our sorrow, though. He meets us as we follow the story forward in our fear. Verse 19 of John chapter 20 says, on the evening of that first day of the week when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. And after he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. You know, a couple things to take note of. You know, they have locked the doors. No one's leaving, no one's entering. That's what fear does. Fear locks the doors. Fear keeps you from going forward. It bars the doors in life so that nothing can get in and nothing can get out. And so you have this false sense of safety from everything that would cause or might cause fear. Fear keeps you from the faith commitment as it fixates on what it might cost and ignores that it's what your soul needs. Fear keeps you from the courageous vocational journey because it focuses on all of the what ifs more than the opportunity. Fear locks the doors to provide a fake sense of safety, but keeps you from everything that life has for you. That's what fear does. And that's what the disciples are experiencing. They're experiencing that because, like it said, they were afraid that the religious establishment might give them the same thing that it gave Jesus, and so they were huddled up together, afraid. And despite the locked doors, Jesus shows up right in the middle of the fear, right in the middle of the disciples' fear. Again, and maybe this is just me, he doesn't come in whipping them around and smacking them around and saying, you dummies. He says, peace. Peace be with you. It's as if Jesus knows that somebody that is in the middle of panic, that somebody that's dealing with fear, they don't need a religious exhortation. They don't need religious challenge. They need somebody showing up to be with them, speaking a word that says, it's okay, I'm safe, and you're safe because you're with me. And that's exactly what Jesus does. Jesus doesn't come whipping and smacking them around, although, let's be honest, it would have made sense. Jesus shows up right in the middle of their nervous heart rates, their clenched muscles and uptight shoulders, in the middle of their locked doors, and says, I come bringing you peace. But he doesn't stop there. It says he showed them his hands and his side. There's something significant about this because the disciples were afraid that if they go out into the world, the religious establishment might do to them what they did to Jesus. But here Jesus is, and he's saying, look, the world did its worst to me, and I'm standing here. Essentially, subtext, you have no reason to fear because I have overcome the grave. The same message is true for us. I know that this is at the risk of being too simplistic with all the different elements of fear in our life. But when you fixate and focus on the one who bears not wounds, but healed scars, Jesus who overcame the grave, when you focus on him, you can go out into the world with decreasing amounts of fear and increasing amounts of courage because the one you follow has overcame everything the world could throw at him. Sometimes that journey of moving towards courage and moving away from fear takes a moment, and sometimes it takes a month. Sometimes it feels like a millennium. But let me tell you, that is the way forward. And I just know in the space like this, there are many of us feeling like we live in little locked spaces where we barred the doors so no one's coming in and no one's coming out. Some of us have done a really good job of locking that little space away so we aren't even totally aware of it ourselves. Be encouraged. Jesus is the master lockpick when it comes to the locked door of fear. He'll show up right in the middle of it. But it goes even farther. Jesus meets us in our doubt. Jesus meets us in our doubt, right in the middle of it. Meets us in our sorrow. He meets us in our fear. He meets us in our doubt. He's not waiting for everybody to get gussied up. He shows up right in the middle of all of our mess. Jesus meets us in our doubt. Verse 24 says, now Thomas, also called Didymus, I understand why he would go by Thomas, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we've seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my fingers where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. First thing we learn from this story, since Thomas was a week late to church, is that, you got to show up early to church. You don't know what's going to happen. Jesus was there. Well, I missed it. Some of you are like sitting in a space, you're like, I don't even have a chair, so you know that. It's best to show up early to church. But the thing that I'm really interested in is like, why wasn't Thomas there the first time? Why? Had he already moved on? John chapter 14 describes Thomas a little bit more, and he seems like he's a tactile, literal guy that needs really concrete things, doesn't understand metaphor, probably didn't have a poetry book in his bookcase. Jesus is like, I go to prepare a place for you. My Father's house has many rooms, and Thomas is like, Jesus, what are you talking about? This whole room thing? Where are these rooms, and what's happening? He needed a bullet point list of this kind of thing. You can go to John chapter 14 to see. Maybe it was just because he was a tactile guy, a literal guy. Okay, this ended, now I got to move on to something else. Maybe it was just too painful to be close to the disciples because the one who had brought true life and true meaning was dead, and to be with the people that you followed him with was a reminder that the one that had given life to meaning was now dead, and so it would better to move on, whether it's to have a drink or be in the sun. Just distance yourself from the one who, from the ones that reminded you of the one who had died. Maybe it was just too painful. We don't know, but finally when the disciples find him, they share the news and they say, no, it really happened. He still doesn't believe. He wasn't there when it happened. He doesn't believe it when the disciples tell him about it. Again, maybe too painful to entertain, maybe compartmentalized, do not touch, off limits. We don't know. But here's the thing. As like I mentioned, have conversations with modern day Thomases, some of my dear friends, I can find out a little bit, I can imagine a little bit about Thomas. Because most of the friends that aren't followers of Jesus, that I'm friends with, again, it's not like they have an intellectual problem with believing in God. They've just been hurt so much in this world, and they're left wondering, like, where was God? Or they were hurt by the church, and they still believe in God, but they don't want to come into the church because it doesn't feel safe. So their doubt is not because of an intellectual head thing, it's because of a heart hurt. This is more often the case. That our doubt doesn't spring from intellectual problems, but heart problems that are very real. Now, isn't it fascinating that in the middle of this, where people, modern day Thomases, first century Thomas, may have had a hard time believing because of the pain, in the middle of this, the central focus of the entire Bible is that God himself endured pain. God didn't come into flesh and say, you know what, I want to be a human, but I actually don't want to experience pain, so I'm going to be a bulletproof Superman type human, and nothing's going to be able to touch me. No, he entered into our full humanity and experienced everything that we experience, from physical pain to emotional and relational pain. So it's a beautiful thing to be able to say to friends, whether it's a modern day Thomas, God knows something about your hurt. But we pick it up in verse 26. It says, a week later, his disciples were in the house again. And then Thomas was with them this time. He did it. He made it. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them. He's replaying this whole scene just for Thomas. He wants Thomas to be up to speed. Peace be with you. He says it again. Then he said to Thomas, looking right at Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand. Put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. And what does Thomas say? My Lord and my God. It's as if Jesus is telling Thomas behind the words, I understand that you have doubted, but here's the proof. It's as if Jesus is telling Thomas, I understand that you're hurt, but so was I. Can I just say, Jesus will meet you in your doubt. He'll meet you in the place of pain that created the doubt in the first place. He'll meet you right there. And he'll say, I know what it feels like to be hurt by the church. I know what it feels like to be hurt. And I'm with you. Then Jesus told him, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. He's speaking to you. Jesus is speaking a blessing over your life. Blessed are those who have believed but haven't seen. Here's the good news, guys. Here's the good news. The good news is that Jesus will meet you in your sorrow, fear, and your doubt. You don't have to clean up or put on airs to be with Jesus. That is the good news. But the good news gets better, because Jesus will meet you in your sorrow, fear, and your doubt, but he won't leave you there. He'll meet you there, but he won't leave you there. And here's the cool thing. If you bring your wounds of sorrow, fear, and doubt to him, if you bring them to him, if you welcome him in, if you make yourself available like he's seeking to make himself available to you, if you do that, what you will find with, sometimes over minutes and sometimes over months, that those wounds get healed. And so years from now, somebody will come up to you with their own wounds of sorrow, fear, and doubt, and you can say, here, look in my life. I bear the marks of wounds, but they've been healed by Jesus. I know what it feels like, and I'm here with you now. They become healing wounds, in the words of Henry Nouwen, to those that we are in relationship that are still in pain. This is what Jesus does. And it's exactly what happened in the first account, the first resurrection. You see, Mary goes and tells all the disciples. She becomes the first apostle, telling the good news about the resurrected Lord to the disciples. And the disciples, those dolts, they eventually get it. And then they start telling all the world. In fact, to the point that when the Roman Empire was threatened by the fact that Jesus' followers were growing, and they said, all right, disciples, you have a choice. You can give up your faith and say you didn't experience anything you said you experienced about what Jesus did, or you can and survive survive or you can die. Those are your choices. And the disciples were like, well, if those are our choices, we choose death because we don't want to say what we experienced didn't happen because there's nothing like it. We will hold fast to what we believe, even in the face of death. Thomas himself said, as tradition says, went as far as India telling people about the good news of Jesus Christ, the doubter. And let me tell you, that's before cars, you guys. That's a tenuous journey from the Middle East to India right now. And he did it on foot. That's a lot of blisters. But it's not just Mary and the disciples and Thomas. It's that news that was passed on through ages, through countries, that's outlasted philosophies and outlasted dynasties. It's outlasted fashion trends. It's growing all over the world, expanding the good news of the resurrected Jesus. It's touched my life. I remember recently looking at a picture, a 9th grade photo of me. It was picture day. And the camera guy said, smile. And like many other 9th grade boys before me, I decided to not smile. Remember looking into that young boy's eyes and seeing a blank look. And I remember him. I remember how he had anger and sorrow and doubt that he was aware of and not aware of. And he was burying that as much as he could with anything he would get his hands on, whether it was a dating relationship or any chemical substance that would come his way. Anything he could do to dull the sense of all the challenges he was experiencing in his life. And I started to grieve that little kid. But then I remembered he didn't stay there. That Jesus showed up right in the middle of it. So that kid with the blank stare didn't grow up to be an adult with the blank stare, but became someone that had the marks of healing on his very life, that could stand before others and said, I was met by Jesus. And I know that's some of your story too. And that's what we celebrate with baptism. And I have some of you, and this morning are here, and that's not your story. And let me just tell you, it can be. It can be your story. In fact, we have prayer stations right there that during the next couple songs, you're free to go up there. But right now, we have baptisms, and there's going to be a video that plays here in a second. You guys, over the course of this Easter weekend here at Anchor, between both of our congregations, we've had 20 baptisms. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that awesome? Baptism is going down under the water, signifying our identity with Christ's death, saying, just as Christ died, my old life is dead. We might struggle with sins in our life and our future, but it doesn't define us. It just confines us. And as we come out of the water, we're identifying with Jesus' resurrection power. Just as he rose to a new life, I'm rising to a new life. And all that sin, all that brokenness, it's in the grave, and I'm living a new life with Jesus. So with that, we have a video that highlights some of our friends that are getting baptized today. So we'll watch that, and then we'll have baptisms. I want you to clap your brains out when those baptisms happen, because that's what heaven is doing, and let's align with what heaven is doing.